I'm mostly a lurker on here, but I've considered sharing my story several times. I was hesitant because absolutely no one knows about this. Not my family, nor my friends. I've held on to this for 10 years now and figured it was time to let it out. Plus, I think there are some valuable lessons that can be learned from my experience. Here we go. For reference, I'm a 27-year-old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago when I was 17. I had just started university and was excited about having a fresh new start, since I had always been the nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before. I had never even been out on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't magically changed since entering university, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was in my room working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on SMN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as me. Intrigued, I accepted. For the sake of the story, we'll call this boy Ken. We got to chatting and I asked him how he had gotten my email address. He dodged the question. I let it go, not thinking too much of it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook and other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city and apparently wasn't much older than I was. As I'd guessed, our roots were in fact in the same country. Let's call it Motherland. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself on his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow, he managed to convince me and we both switched on our webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal. Our chats carried on for a couple of weeks. They developed into texting and we even had a few calls. After I had agreed to give him my number, I started to develop a crush on Ken. He asked me to go out with him a couple of times, but I was always busy with school and our schedules weren't lining up. Finally, we found one afternoon where we were both free and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and had offered to pick me up from my university after I was done for the day. I was a little too dressed up for my C+ programming class, but just right for the lunch date that we had had at a local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going, or with whom, because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date, at almost 18. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The side window rolled down and sure enough, there was Ken sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was as cute as in person as he was on the webcam. However, what I wasn't expecting was the intense smell of weed floating out of the car. Not relevant, but a part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and was concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors in motion for me to get in, and so I did, without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat and he immediately put his hand on my thigh, I nervously shifted my leg away. So, I started, "Do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me but didn't say anything and just started driving. Okay, kinda weird. I thought maybe he was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try my hand at a little small talk, which I'm no good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry because the restaurant was not far from my campus, and there was no reason for us to be getting on the highway. You don't need to take the highway. The restaurant is really close by. I can guide you there. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke, for the first time since I'd gotten into the car. I thought maybe we could just go to my place instead. We can play Need for Speed and I can make lunch for you. I was 17, on my way to the house of a guy that I had just met for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do, despite the clear red flags waving in my face. I decided that I didn't want to ruin our first date by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play NSF together, which I had told him I liked playing. Don't judge me. So, like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home and was situated in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside and, of course, no one was home except us. It was sparsely furnished and it looked unkempt, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted the empty space beside him for me to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in his room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. I started to relax as we played NSF, and he made us PB&Js for lunch. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got up onto his bed and sat down directly behind me, his legs on either side of me, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his hands moved from the controller and slid up under my shirt. That's when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to try to grope my chest, but instead, he started squeezing and massaging my belly. I was more than a little chubby back then, freshman 15 and then some, so you can imagine what that might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words at what he did, but he did nothing but smirk at me and told me that he liked it. I felt completely disgusted and violated, and I'd had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and that I needed to go. He asked where I lived so he could drop me off. Thankfully, I had the common sense to not tell him, and I asked him to drop me back off to the school instead, where I would supposedly be meeting my classmates. He obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on the messaging service or on my phone, the only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages and I ignored all of his calls. Once he messaged me on MSN around 11 p.m. asking me to come over and telling me that he would send a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I responded, "What do you take me for? Why do you even think I would want to do that?" He replied saying, "No sex, I promise." Just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even respond. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months and then suddenly vanished. I figured he had finally gotten the point. Now I wish the story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on a holiday to visit another relative, who we'll call Anne, who was living in the Caribbean at the time. Anne, whom I love dearly, was and still is a bit of an eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with the motherland, more than the rest of us are, and goes back for frequent visits. While we stayed with her, she told us about her most recent spiritual trip to the motherland, where she had met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend. Let's call her Connie, the con artist. During our visit, Anne introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lives in the motherland. And we chatted with her a couple of times throughout our vacation, and got to know her a little bit. Little did we know that back then, the Connie who Anne had spontaneously met halfway across the world in Motherland would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. Now, that's a story that I'm just not and may never be ready to tell because of how many lives were affected and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. What you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family from long before Anne had accidentally met her. Their meeting was definitely no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100K from our family, but she took any peace of mind or sense of security that we ever had. When we finally called on and confronted her, she insisted that we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we had forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with my story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now. But we first spoke to her online in April, and I remember the whole ordeal lasting well into the fall. While she normally resided in Motherland, Anne had invited her to visit and stay with us where we were, and my whole family and I presently live. That's when things really took a turn for the worse. Some of the things I clearly remember and are important to this story were that, 1, the whole time she was trying to stay with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school and program in the US. I don't even live in the US, and was actually getting very pushy about it. And 2, she had asked me if I was a virgin and told me to save myself from my husband. It's disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think of anything but the situation at hand. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely, and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends and my university friends, who were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward to one day, after Connie's final disappearance in the fall. I was at home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID and it was a number I didn't have saved, so it was showing the contact information as whatever name the phone was registered under. My heart dropped into my stomach. My phone displayed a name. The first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I started to panic and ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect. When I picked up the phone, I was greeted by a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke when I came to a sudden realization that he had been a part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove that he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname, originating from the part of Motherland where Connie is from, and I had never known Ken's last name until then, and the fact that he had contacted me out of the blue, and I had no idea why or how, were all just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called, and I told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was just a weird, dry half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the most creepy voice you can think of, and hung up. I knew in my gut that this was their last attempt to get back in touch, and somehow slither their way back into mine and my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after this all ended, I was having a conversation with a family member who was also closely involved in all of this about the whole ordeal, and she told me she had sensed something extremely wrong when Connie was pushing to have me sent off to the US, to that obscure school. She had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of trafficking scene, and that if I left, she would never see me again. The horrifying pieces came together for me at that time. I was just too naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken had told me, no sex, I promise, when he invited me over, and how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. I strongly and firmly believed that Ken had been some sort of player in Connie's game, and he was just there to keep me away from guys and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those who may be wondering, we never called the police on Connie or Ken, because technically nothing illegal happened. At face value, it's very hard to explain. I'll also mention that I tried to find Ken online many times after this all ended. I don't know why I felt like I wanted to expose him or call him out, and I wasn't able to find even a sliver of information on him. Not by the name Ken, nor by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he didn't even exist. Also, I am awful at directions and didn't remember his address or where his house was exactly. I'm sorry if this story is too convoluted or confusing. I'm trying to get my point across without giving out any names or too many additional details, which does make it a little challenging. I hope this can serve as a warning to young people to never trust anyone, to do your thorough checks on people, especially those you meet online, and to be very aware and wary of people's intentions. Also, from this incident onward, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea of them to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can attract both vulnerable people and also unsavory characters who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgment for those who are into that sort of thing. It's just definitely not for me. I would like to hear what you guys think about this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible? What do you make of this? Stay safe, everyone, and to Ken and Connie. If I see either of you again, I'll kick you in the face. Rotten hell. Update. I don't think people would be so interested to know which country these scammers came from. This is a throwaway, so whatever. For all of you who guessed India, well, you're correct. Part of the purpose of sharing this experience was to help alert others to potential dangers like these. I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't release this information. The supposed spiritual organization was Art of Living, and this wasn't my first bad experience with them. I also see AOL is getting a lot of attention here, and I think I need to be more clear and provide some more information. Connie was not an AOL leader, representative, or anything like that. She seemed to be a participant or a lingerer who was there